I still remember the exact moment my heart sank. The moment my own son looked me in the eye across a crowded restaurant table and said something no mother ever expects to hear. "You're worthless, Mom." Dad's new wife actually supports him. For a second, I thought I must have misunderstood him. The clatter of dishes, the low hum of conversations around us, the smell of grilled chicken and fresh bread drifting from the kitchen, all of it seemed to blur together as if the world had tilted slightly off balance. My name is Margaret Collins. I'm 67 years old, and that afternoon was supposed to be a simple lunch with my son. Just lunch. The kind of ordinary moment mothers hold on to when their children grow up and life pulls everyone in different directions. Daniel had called me 2 days earlier, his voice short but polite. "Mom, do you want to grab lunch on Thursday?" he asked. I remember staring at my phone for a few seconds after the call ended, feeling a small spark of hope. It had been months since we'd spent time alone together. Months since we'd talked about anything that wasn't tense or awkward or painfully brief. I chose a little cafe near the park downtown, the kind with big windows and sunlight pouring over wooden tables. I arrived 15 minutes early, something I've always done. Old habits from years of raising a child on schedules and school mornings. I ordered iced tea and waited, watching people walk by outside, couples with strollers, office workers rushing past with takeout bags. When Daniel walked in, he looked taller than I remembered, even though that's impossible for a 38-year-old man. But something about him felt different. Harder. He barely smiled when he saw me. "Hi, Mom," he said, sliding into the seat across from me. "Hi, sweetheart." I answered automatically, even though I could feel the distance between us like a cold draft slipping through a cracked window. At first the conversation stayed safe. Work, traffic, the weather, the kind of small talk strangers make in elevators. I kept trying to find a bridge back to the son I raised, the boy who used to sit at the kitchen counter eating cereal while telling me about his dreams of becoming an architect. Then his phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen and smiled in a way I hadn't seen directed at me in years. "Vanessa just sent me a photo," he said casually. Vanessa, his father's new wife. The woman who appeared in our lives like a sudden storm 3 years ago. I nodded slowly and took a sip of my tea, hoping the subject would pass. But it didn't. Daniel leaned back in his chair and started talking about her, as if he were describing a hero. "She's amazing with Dad," he said. "Honestly, I've never seen him happier." I forced a small smile. "I'm glad he's doing well," I said quietly. But Daniel kept going. He talked about dinners they hosted, vacations they planned, how Vanessa always made sure his father was taken care of. The words stacked up, one after another, each one building a quiet pressure in my chest. Finally he looked straight at me, his expression tightening, as if something he had been holding back suddenly pushed its way out. His voice wasn't loud at first, but it carried across the table with sharp clarity. "You know what the difference is, Mom," he said. I felt my hands go still around the glass of iced tea. "What difference?" I asked softly. Daniel didn't hesitate. "Vanessa actually supports Dad. She's not bitter. She's not dragging him down." A couple at the next table glanced over, sensing the tension before I even fully understood what was happening. I tried to keep my voice calm. "Daniel, I'm not sure this is a good conversation for lunch." But he leaned forward, frustration flashing across his face. And then the sentence came out, clear and unmistakable, the one that would echo in my mind for days afterward. "You're worthless, Mom. Dad's new wife isn't." The words hung in the air between us, heavy and impossible to ignore. Somewhere behind me a waiter dropped a fork and it clattered against the floor, but at our table everything had gone completely silent. I felt every eye in the room turning toward us, though maybe that was just my imagination. My own son had just called me worthless in the middle of a restaurant on a bright Thursday afternoon. And the strangest part was not the anger I felt. It was the stillness. Because in that moment, instead of shouting back or defending myself, I simply looked at Daniel and said nothing. I did not argue with him. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend myself the way most people probably expected. Instead, I simply looked at Daniel, the same boy I once held in my arms when he was small enough to fall asleep on my shoulder during long car rides home, and I felt a strange calm settle over me. The restaurant noise slowly returned, forks clinking against plates, low conversations resuming around us, but at our table the air still felt heavy. Daniel leaned back in his chair as if he had finally said something he had been holding in for years. There was a certain confidence in his expression, the kind people have when they believe they are standing on the right side of the story. I folded my napkin carefully beside my plate and took a small sip of my iced tea. My hands were steady, even though my heart felt like it had dropped somewhere deep inside my chest. For a moment, Daniel seemed almost confused by my silence. He had expected an argument, maybe even a scene. But I simply studied his face the way mothers sometimes do, noticing the familiar shape of his eyebrows, the small line forming between them when he was frustrated, the same line he had when he was a teenager trying to explain why he had come home past midnight. Only now there was something else behind his eyes, something colder, something shaped by years of stories I had never been allowed to correct. A waitress approached our table slowly, holding a small notepad as if she was unsure whether it was safe to interrupt. "Are you ready to order?" she asked carefully. Daniel barely looked at her. "I will have the steak sandwich," he said. "Medium." I nodded politely and ordered a bowl of soup, even though I suddenly had no appetite at all. When the waitress walked away, Daniel crossed his arms and looked at me again. "You are not even going to respond?" he asked. His voice carried a sharp edge, almost disappointed. I gave a small, tired smile. "There is nothing useful that comes from arguing in the middle of a restaurant," I said calmly. He shook his head as if my answer only proved his point. "That is the problem, Mom. You always avoid things. Vanessa says people like you never take responsibility." Hearing her name again felt like a small stone dropping into a quiet lake. The ripples of it spread through my mind, bringing back memories I had spent years trying to keep peaceful for Daniel's sake. I looked out the window for a moment, watching a city bus roll slowly past the corner, people stepping on and off with their bags and coffee cups, everyone living their lives without knowing that one family story was quietly unraveling inside this little cafe. When I turned back to Daniel, he was staring at me with impatience, waiting for a reaction that never came. "You know," he continued, lowering his voice slightly, "Dad says things were miserable for years before the divorce. Vanessa helped him see that life could be better." I let those words settle for a moment. They were not new to me. I had heard versions of that story before, sometimes through relatives, sometimes through awkward holiday conversations that ended quickly. But hearing them directly from my son still carried a quiet sting. The soup arrived a few minutes later, steam rising gently from the bowl. I picked up my spoon and stirred it slowly even though I did not take a bite. Daniel watched me as if trying to decide whether my silence meant guilt or indifference. Finally, he sighed and leaned back again. "See, this is exactly what I mean," he said. "You never say anything real." I placed the spoon down and met his eyes. My voice was soft but steady when I finally spoke. "Daniel," I said, "one day you might want to hear the full story. Not just the version that is easiest to believe." He frowned slightly. "What is that supposed to mean?" I simply shook my head and reached for my purse. "It means today is probably not the day for that conversation." I stood up slowly, leaving a few bills on the table to cover my soup and tea. Daniel looked genuinely surprised now, as if he had expected the lunch to end with him proving something important. Instead, he watched his 67-year-old mother quietly put on her coat. Before I turned away, I looked at him one more time and said something very simple, something that even now still echoes in my memory. "Take care of yourself, Daniel." Then I walked out of the cafe, leaving my untouched soup behind, along with the words he had thrown across the table. And as I stepped into the cool afternoon air, I realized something else too. For the first time in a very long time, I was no longer afraid of the truth coming out. I was only waiting for the right moment. I walked for nearly 20 minutes after leaving the cafe, even though my car was parked less than a block away. The cool afternoon air moved gently through the streets, carrying the distant sound of traffic and the occasional laughter of people enjoying the mild weather. Normally, I love days like that. Early fall in our town always had a certain calm to it, with golden leaves gathering along the sidewalks and the sunlight soft enough to make everything feel peaceful. But that afternoon, I barely noticed any of it. Daniel's words kept replaying in my mind, not loudly, but steadily, like a song stuck in the background of my thoughts. "You are worthless, Mom. Dad's new wife actually supports him." I had expected anger from him over the years. I had expected distance. What I had never quite prepared myself for was hearing that kind of sentence spoken so easily, as if it had already become a truth he believed without question. When I finally reached my car, I sat behind the steering wheel for a long moment without starting the engine. My hands rested quietly in my lap while I looked out through the windshield at the small park across the street. A group of children were running near the playground while their parents watched from a nearby bench. Seeing them brought back a memory so clearly that for a moment it felt like stepping into another time. Daniel was 6 years old, maybe 7, wearing a bright red jacket that was slightly too big for him because I had bought it one size larger so he could grow into it. He had insisted on climbing every piece of playground equipment that afternoon, announcing proudly that he was going to be an architect one day because architects built amazing things. I remember sitting on the bench with a cup of coffee, smiling as he waved at me from the top of the slide. Back then he trusted me completely. Back then the world was simple enough that a mother's voice was the one her child believed most. I started the engine slowly and drove home, letting the familiar streets guide me through neighborhoods that had not changed much over the years. Small houses with tidy lawns, mailboxes at the end of driveways, the occasional American flag hanging from a porch railing. When I pulled into my driveway, the house looked exactly the way it always had, quiet and still under the late afternoon light. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, placing my purse on the small table in the hallway. The living room smelled faintly like lavender from the candle I had burned the night before. Everything looked calm, ordinary, almost as if the conversation at the cafe had happened somewhere far away. I made myself a cup of tea and carried it into the study at the back of the house. That room had slowly become my favorite place over the years. It was small but filled with things that reminded me of different chapters of life. Family photographs lined one wall, and a tall bookshelf stood beside the window. But the object my eyes drifted toward almost immediately was an old wooden box resting on the lower shelf of a cabinet near the desk. The box was not large, maybe about 12 inches long, with a smooth lid and small brass hinges that had darkened with age. I had not opened it in a long time, though I knew exactly what was inside. For several minutes, I simply sat there holding my tea, watching the sunlight stretch across the floor while the quiet of the house wrapped around me. Daniel's voice echoed once more in my memory, full of certainty, full of anger shaped by a story he believed was complete. But stories are rarely complete when only one side is heard. Eventually, I placed the cup down on the desk and walked over to the cabinet. My fingers rested lightly on the wooden lid before I lifted it open. Inside were several neatly organized envelopes, a few printed emails, and a small stack of photographs that had been tucked away years earlier. I had kept them hidden for a reason, not out of shame, but out of protection. At the time, I believed silence would help Daniel grow up without carrying the weight of adult mistakes that were never his responsibility. But as I stood there looking at the contents of that box, something became clear in a way it never had before. Silence had protected him when he was a child. Now it was protecting the wrong story. I closed the lid gently and sat back down at the desk, staring at the box while the evening light slowly faded outside the window. Daniel believed he knew what had happened in our family. He believed he understood who had hurt whom and who had walked away. But the truth was sitting quietly inside that wooden box, waiting patiently the way it had for years. And for the first time since the divorce, I began to wonder if the moment had finally come when my son needed to see it. That evening the house felt quieter than usual, the kind of silence that makes every small sound stand out. The ticking clock in the hallway seemed louder, and the refrigerator hummed softly in the kitchen while the last light of the day faded outside the windows. I remained seated at the desk in my study for a long time, looking at the wooden box in front of me as if it might open on its own. For years I had told myself that keeping those documents hidden was the right decision. Daniel was young when his father and I separated. He was still trying to understand the world, still learning how families worked, and why sometimes they did not work the way children expect them to. I believed that protecting him from the full truth would give him something valuable, the ability to keep loving both of his parents without feeling like he had to choose sides. At the time, that seemed like the kindest choice a mother could make. But time changes things. Children grow up, and stories that were once simplified for their sake slowly turn into permanent beliefs. I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes for a moment, remembering the years that followed the divorce. Daniel had gone to college 2 states away, and during those early years we still spoke regularly. Our conversations were not always easy, but there was still warmth in them. That warmth slowly faded after his father remarried. Vanessa appeared in Daniel's life like a carefully written character entering the middle of a story, already confident in the role she intended to play. At first, Daniel only mentioned her occasionally. He would say things like, "Dad seems happier these days," or "Vanessa is really organized." Those comments sounded harmless, almost polite. But over time they changed. The compliments grew stronger. The comparisons began quietly, then became more direct. I remember one phone call about 2 years ago when Daniel said something that stayed with me longer than I expected. He told me that Vanessa was very supportive of his father's work and that she encouraged him in ways he had never experienced before. I had simply replied that I was glad his father had someone who cared about him. That answer had been honest, but it had also been incomplete. What Daniel never knew was how much effort it took to keep those conversations calm. Each time he praised Vanessa, I could feel the weight of the truth pressing gently against the walls I had built around it. I never corrected him. I never shared what I knew. Instead, I listened and changed the subject, believing that time might soften everything eventually. That afternoon at the cafe showed me how wrong that hope had been. Daniel no longer spoke about Vanessa as just a new member of the family. He spoke about her as the person who had rescued his father from a miserable life, the person who had somehow stepped in to fix problems that he believed I had caused. I opened the wooden box again and carefully lifted the top envelope. Inside were printed copies of email conversations from years earlier. The dates were clear, the names unmistakable. They told a story that Daniel had never been shown. Beneath the emails were photographs from a business conference his father attended nearly a year before the divorce was even mentioned. Vanessa appeared in several of those pictures, standing beside him with a familiar smile that I now recognized instantly. At the bottom of the box were a few handwritten notes and a timeline I had created long ago when everything first began to fall apart. I had gathered the information quietly, not out of revenge, but because I needed to understand what had actually happened to my marriage. Back then I had planned to show Daniel someday, perhaps when he was older and able to see the situation with balanced eyes. But when the divorce was finalized and life moved forward, that moment never seemed to arrive. Until now. I placed the papers back into their envelopes and closed the lid once more. The decision forming in my mind did not feel dramatic or angry. In fact, it felt surprisingly calm. Daniel had spoken with certainty at that restaurant because he believed he already knew the truth. He believed his mother had failed his father and that another woman had stepped in to do what I could not. I stood up slowly and walked to the kitchen to refill my tea. As I waited for the kettle to warm the water, I realized something important. I was not interested in proving Daniel wrong in a loud or painful way. I did not want revenge, and I certainly did not want another argument across a table. What I wanted was much simpler. I wanted my son to see the full story for himself. When I returned to the study with the fresh cup of tea, I placed the wooden box on the desk and opened my laptop beside it. The screen lit up the room with a soft glow while evening settled outside the windows. My fingers rested on the keyboard for a moment before I began typing a short message to Daniel. It was only one sentence long. I read it twice before sending it, knowing that once the message left my computer, the quiet balance I had maintained for years would finally begin to shift. I sat at the desk for a long moment after sending the message, listening to the faint hum of the laptop while the room around me slowly grew darker. The sentence I had written was simple, almost ordinary, but I knew it carried more weight than Daniel would realize at first. The message read, "If you ever want to understand what really happened in our family, I have something you should see." I did not add anything else. No accusation. No explanation. Just that single line. After I pressed send, I closed the laptop and looked again at the wooden box resting on the desk. For years that box had stayed quietly on the shelf, holding pieces of a story that only I fully understood. Now it felt different somehow, as if it had finally been given a purpose again. I carried the box into the living room and placed it on the coffee table, then turned on a small lamp beside the couch. The soft yellow light filled the room with a calm warmth that made the evening feel slower than usual. I poured myself another cup of tea and sat down, wondering how Daniel would react when he read the message. Part of me expected anger. Another part expected silence. Daniel had always been stubborn, even as a child. When he decided something was true, he held on to that belief tightly. I could still remember him at 10 years old arguing with his teacher about a science project because he was convinced his design for a small bridge made from wooden sticks would hold more weight than anyone else's. When the teacher tested it with a stack of textbooks, the bridge collapsed after the fourth book. Daniel had stared at the broken pieces for a long time before quietly admitting he might have miscalculated. That memory came back to me now as I sat in the quiet living room, because the look on his face that afternoon at the restaurant reminded me of the same stubborn certainty. He believed his version of the story was solid and unbreakable. But sometimes certainty is built on information that is only half complete. About 30 minutes later, my phone buzzed softly on the table beside me. The screen lit up with Daniel's name. I looked at the message without opening it immediately, letting the moment stretch for just a few seconds. When I finally tapped the screen, his reply appeared in short, direct words. "What are you talking about?" I could almost hear the confusion in his voice even through the text. I did not answer right away. Instead, I stood up, walked back to the study, and opened the wooden box again. One by one, I removed the envelopes and placed them neatly across the desk. The printed emails were still perfectly clear even after all these years. The dates told their own quiet story, a timeline that began long before Daniel ever heard the word divorce spoken in our house. Beneath those papers were the photographs from that business conference, showing his father and Vanessa standing side by side months before anyone admitted they knew each other well. I gathered the documents carefully and slid them into a large folder, arranging everything in the order that made the story easiest to follow. By the time I finished organizing the papers, another message from Daniel appeared. On my phone. "Mom," he wrote this time, the single word carrying a little more impatience. I finally typed back. My fingers moved slowly across the screen as I chose my words with care. "You said something important at lunch today," I wrote. "You said you believed you knew why your father and I separated. I think you deserve the chance to see the full picture." A few seconds passed before the small notification showed that he was typing. I could imagine him sitting somewhere with his phone in his hand, probably frowning slightly the way he always did when he was trying to figure something out. His reply came through a moment later. "Are you saying Dad lied?" I read the question twice before responding. The truth was more complicated than that, and I did not want to begin this conversation by attacking anyone. Instead, I answered simply, "I am saying there are things you were never shown." The three small dots appeared on the screen again as Daniel began typing another message, but then they disappeared. A minute passed, then two. Finally, his next message arrived. "What things?" I looked down at the folder on the desk beside me and rested my hand lightly on top of it. The moment had arrived sooner than I expected. I typed one final sentence before setting the phone back on the table. "If you want to know, come by next Saturday afternoon. I will show you everything." The rest of the week passed more slowly than usual, as if time itself had decided to stretch every hour just a little longer. After Daniel's last message on Thursday evening, there were no more texts that night. I did not push the conversation further. I knew my son well enough to understand that when something unsettled him, he needed space to think. Friday morning arrived quietly, with sunlight slipping through the kitchen window while I prepared my usual breakfast of toast and eggs. Normally, I listened to the radio during breakfast, but that morning I left it off and let the calm silence of the house settle around me. Every now and then my eyes drifted toward the phone resting on the counter, but no new messages appeared. I told myself that was perfectly fine. The invitation had been given, and the decision now belonged to Daniel. By late afternoon, my phone finally buzzed again. I wiped my hands on a kitchen towel and picked it up. Daniel's message was short. "Saturday at 3? I read the words twice, feeling a small shift of relief move through my chest. 3 o'clock works, I replied. That was all that needed to be said. The next 2 days moved forward with a strange mix of ordinary routines and quiet anticipation. On Saturday morning, I woke earlier than usual and walked through the house slowly, noticing details that I had not paid attention to in a while. The framed photographs on the hallway wall showed different stages of Daniel's life. His first day of kindergarten with a backpack almost as big as he was, his high school graduation in a dark blue gown, the proud smile on his face when he received his college diploma. Each picture captured a moment when our relationship had felt simple and strong. Seeing those memories reminded me why I had protected the truth for so long. Mothers often carry difficult information quietly because they believe love sometimes means shielding their children from pain. But children grow into adults, and adults deserve clarity even when it is uncomfortable. Around noon, I placed the folder of documents on the dining room table and arranged the papers in a neat order. I did not want the conversation to feel chaotic or emotional. I wanted Daniel to see everything calmly, one piece at a time, the way someone might review a timeline in a history book. By 2:30 that afternoon, the house was ready. The curtains were open, letting warm light fill the room, and a pot of coffee sat waiting on the kitchen counter in case Daniel wanted some. When the doorbell finally rang at exactly 3 o'clock, I felt my heart beat a little faster, but my hands remained steady. I walked to the door and opened it to find Daniel standing on the porch with his hands in his jacket pockets. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He looked slightly tired, as if he had spent the last 2 days thinking more than sleeping. "Hi, Mom," he said quietly. "Hello, Daniel," I answered, stepping aside so he could come in. He walked into the house slowly, glancing around the living room in the familiar way people do when they return to a place filled with memories. "It has been a while since I was here," he said. "Yes, it has," I replied gently. We moved toward the dining room together, and his eyes quickly noticed the folder resting on the table. He stopped a few feet away from it, looking at the stack of papers with curiosity mixed with caution. "Is that what you were talking about?" he asked. I nodded. "Everything you asked about is in there," I said calmly. Daniel pulled out a chair and sat down, resting his elbows on the table while studying the folder as if it might suddenly reveal its contents on its own. "I still do not understand what you think this is going to prove," he said after a moment. I sat down across from him and folded my hands together on the table. "I am not trying to prove anything," I answered. "I only want you to see the full timeline for yourself." Daniel looked at me for a few seconds, then finally reached forward and opened the folder. The first sheet he lifted was one of the printed emails. His eyes moved slowly across the page while the quiet afternoon light filled the room around us. For a long moment he said nothing. Then his eyebrows pulled together slightly as he looked at the date printed at the top of the message. "Wait," he said softly, glancing up at me with confusion. "This says it was sent almost a year before the divorce." I simply nodded and let the silence give him space to continue reading, knowing that the story he believed so confidently was about to begin changing piece by piece. Daniel continued reading the first email slowly, his eyes moving back and forth across the printed lines as if he was trying to make sure he had not misunderstood the date at the top of the page. The dining room was completely quiet except for the faint sound of a car passing outside on the street. I did not interrupt him. I simply watched as his expression shifted from curiosity to confusion. After a moment, he picked up the second page in the folder and read that one as well. His shoulders straightened slightly in the chair. "This is between Dad and Vanessa," he said carefully. I nodded once. "Yes." He looked back down at the email again, this time reading parts of it out loud under his breath. The message was simple and friendly, but the tone between them was already familiar, the kind of tone people have when they have known each other longer than they admit. Daniel's eyes moved again to the date printed at the top corner of the page. "But Dad told me he met Vanessa after the divorce," he said slowly. I folded my hands together on the table and answered in the same calm voice I had used since he arrived. "That is what he told many people." Daniel picked up the next document in the stack. It was another printed email, sent 3 months after the first one. He read it more quickly this time, his eyebrows pulling together as he moved from one paragraph to the next. "This one says they had dinner in Chicago after the conference," he said, looking up again with a puzzled expression. "The divorce was not even discussed until almost a year after that." "That is correct," I replied. Daniel leaned back in his chair and stared at the papers for a few seconds. The certainty he carried into the house was beginning to soften around the edges. I could see it in the way he looked back and forth between the documents, as if he hoped the information would somehow rearrange itself into something easier to accept. Finally, he reached deeper into the folder and pulled out one of the photographs. It showed a group of people standing in a hotel conference room, smiling politely for the camera. Daniel studied it carefully until his eyes settled on 2 familiar faces standing side by side near the center of the group. "That is Dad," he said quietly. Then he looked a little closer and added, "And that is Vanessa." I nodded again. That photo was taken at the same conference mentioned in the first email. Daniel turned the photograph over in his hands and looked at the printed timestamp on the back. His breathing slowed slightly as he began to understand the timeline unfolding in front of him. "So they already knew each other well before the divorce," he said. It was not really a question. "Yes," I answered gently. Daniel rubbed his forehead with one hand and looked down at the table. For a long moment, he did not say anything. The room felt heavier now, not because anyone was raising their voice, but because the story he had believed for years was beginning to change shape. Eventually, he picked up another sheet of paper from the folder. This one was part of the timeline I had written years ago, when I first tried to make sense of everything that had happened. The dates were arranged carefully with short notes explaining where each piece of information came from. Daniel read the first few lines, then the next. His eyes moved faster now as he followed the sequence of events from one month to the next. "I did not know about any of this," he said quietly. "I know," I replied. He looked up at me again, and this time there was less certainty in his expression and more searching. "Why did you never tell me?" he asked. The question hung between us for a moment before I answered. "Because you were young when everything happened," I said softly. "You loved your father, and I did not want you to feel like you had to choose sides." Daniel looked back down at the documents again. The photograph remained in his hand, while the other papers rested on the table in front of him. "Vanessa always said she met Dad after you two were already separated," he murmured. I did not respond right away. Instead, I allowed him the time he needed to connect the pieces himself. After another minute, he slowly set the photograph back on the table and leaned back in his chair. The confident tone he had used at the restaurant earlier in the week was gone now, replaced by something quieter and uncertain. "So the story I heard all these years was not exactly the whole story," he said finally. I looked at him with the same calm patience I had carried since that afternoon at the cafe. "No," I said gently. "It was only part of it." Daniel sat very still after that, his eyes resting on the scattered documents as if he was seeing them and not seeing them at the same time. The confidence he had carried with him into my house that afternoon had faded almost completely, replaced by a quiet tension that filled the room. Outside the window, a light breeze moved through the trees, and the soft rustling of leaves drifted into the silence between us. After nearly a full minute, Daniel leaned forward again and picked up another sheet from the folder. This one contained several printed messages exchanged months after the first conference. Messages that were polite but personal in a way that suggested familiarity far beyond two coworkers who had recently met. He read slowly, carefully, as though every line might reveal something he had never considered before. When he reached the end of the page, he set it down and rubbed his hands together thoughtfully. "Dad always told me the marriage ended because the two of you had grown apart," he said quietly. "He said you stopped supporting his work and that things at home became cold." I listened without interrupting, letting him finish the thought. "Vanessa said something similar," he added. "She said she helped him realize he deserved a happier life." His voice carried less certainty now, almost as if he was repeating a story that no longer felt completely stable. I nodded slowly, acknowledging what he had been told without dismissing it. "Your father and I did struggle toward the end of our marriage," I said calmly. "Many couples do after decades together. But the timeline you are seeing in those papers explains something important. The connection between your father and Vanessa began long before the separation was ever discussed." Daniel looked down again at the documents, tracing one of the printed dates with his finger. "So when they told everyone they met after the divorce, that was not exactly true," he said. "No," I answered gently. He leaned back in his chair once more and stared toward the window, thinking. The afternoon sunlight had begun to soften into the warm color of early evening, casting long shadows across the dining room table. For several moments, neither of us spoke. I knew this part would take time. When a person begins to realize that a story they trusted for years may not be complete, the mind does not change instantly. It adjusts slowly, one thought at a time. Daniel finally looked back at me with an expression I had not seen in a long while. It was the same thoughtful look he used to have as a teenager when he realized he might have misunderstood something important. "Why did Dad never mention any of this?" he asked quietly. I chose my words carefully before answering. "I cannot speak for your father," I said. "People often simplify complicated situations when they explain them to others. Sometimes they believe the simplified version themselves." Daniel let out a slow breath and glanced again at the photograph lying on the table. He picked it up one more time, studying the image of his father and Vanessa standing side by side at the conference. "I told you something awful at lunch this week," he said after a moment, his voice lower than before. I did not respond immediately. I simply watched him, allowing the realization to come from his own reflection. "I said you were worthless," he continued, shaking his head slightly, as if the sentence now sounded foreign to him. I said Dad's new wife supported him in ways you never did. He placed the photograph back on the table with slow care. I thought I understood everything that happened between you two. His eyes met mine again, this time carrying something very different from the anger I had seen in the cafe. There was uncertainty now, and perhaps the beginning of regret. I kept my voice calm when I answered. You believed what you were told, Daniel. That is natural. He looked down again at the folder, flipping through the remaining pages until he reached the final sheet of the timeline I had written years ago. After reading it, he closed the folder gently and rested both hands on top of it. So the story was never as simple as I thought, he said quietly. I gave a small nod. Very few family stories are. The room grew silent again, but this time the silence felt different. It was no longer heavy with accusation or misunderstanding. Instead, it felt like the quiet pause that comes when a person begins to see a larger picture for the first time, piece by piece, realizing that the truth had been waiting patiently all along. Daniel remained seated at the table with both hands resting on the closed folder, his eyes fixed on the papers, as if the story inside them was still rearranging itself in his mind. The late afternoon light had begun to fade, and the room slowly filled with the warm glow of the lamp from the living room spilling through the doorway. For several moments, neither of us spoke. I had learned long ago that silence can sometimes give people the space they need to understand something fully. Finally, Daniel lifted his head and looked at me again. The sharp anger that had been in his eyes at the restaurant earlier in the week was gone now. In its place was something quieter and more thoughtful. I did not know any of this, he said again, his voice softer than before. I nodded gently. I know you did not. He glanced down at the folder once more, then slowly slid it across the table toward me, as if returning something valuable that had never truly belonged to him. I spent years believing a very different story, he said. I thought you were the one who gave up on the marriage. I thought Dad finally found someone who treated him better. I listened carefully without interrupting, letting him say everything that had been building in his mind. Vanessa always spoke about you as if you had pushed Dad away, he continued. She said she helped him rebuild his confidence after everything fell apart. He paused for a moment and shook his head slightly. But these dates, they tell a completely different timeline. I folded the papers back into the folder slowly and rested my hands on the table. Sometimes people explain complicated situations in ways that make them easier to live with, I said calmly. Daniel gave a quiet nod, as if the idea made sense now in a way it never had before. He leaned back in his chair and looked around the dining room, his eyes briefly stopping on the old photographs hanging on the wall. One of them showed him at 12 years old holding a small fishing rod beside a lake, smiling proudly after catching his first fish. When he looked back at me, there was a trace of sadness in his expression. I said something terrible to you this week, he said slowly. At lunch. I did not respond right away because the words were still clear in my memory. I could still hear the sharpness of his voice in that crowded cafe. But the anger that might have followed those words had already passed through me days earlier. Daniel continued speaking before I answered. I said you were worthless, he said quietly. I cannot believe I said that. His shoulders dropped slightly, as if the weight of the sentence had finally settled on him. I thought I was defending Dad, he added. But now I realize I was repeating a story I never questioned. I met his eyes and spoke gently. You believed what you had been told for many years, Daniel. It is not unusual for people to trust the version of events that reaches them first. He looked down at his hands for a moment and then back at me again. Still, he said, that does not make what I said right. The room was silent for a few seconds after that. Finally, Daniel stood up from his chair and walked slowly around the table until he was standing beside me. For a moment, he hesitated the way adults sometimes do when they are unsure how to repair something that has been damaged by words. Then he placed one hand gently on my shoulder. I am sorry, Mom, he said. The apology was simple but sincere, and I could hear the effort it took for him to say it. I reached up and placed my hand over his for a brief moment. Thank you for saying that, I replied quietly. He nodded once, then stepped back and glanced again at the folder on the table. I think I need to have a conversation with Dad, he said thoughtfully. There are some questions I need to ask. I gave a small understanding nod. That is something only you can decide, I said. Daniel walked toward the front door a few minutes later, pausing briefly in the hallway where the family photographs hung. He studied them for a moment before turning back to me with a faint, reflective smile. Family stories are more complicated than I realized, he said. Yes, I answered gently. They usually are. He opened the door and stepped outside into the cool evening air, then turned back once more before leaving the porch. Thank you for showing me the truth, he said. I watched him walk down the driveway toward his car, and as the quiet settled around the house again, I realized something important. Sometimes the strongest response to hurtful words is not anger, and it is not revenge. Sometimes it is patience and the quiet confidence that the truth, when given the chance, can speak clearly all on its own.